Hi, my name is Hilal. I'm going to present my research, which I finished under supervision, expert of urban design Melih Birik. Evaluation of walkable spaces through multi-sensory urban experience, Istanbul Kadıköy example. Here is a brief look at my presentation. Introduction, perception of space and walkability, the evaluation of walkable spaces in Kadıköy through multi-sensory experience, conclusion, and references. In my research, the main question was how do the walkability variable and sensory experience affect each other. Space contains the individual experience of the subject perceiving it via multi-sensory stimuli, which experiences affect the space itself also. The more diverse the range of sensory stimuli, the deeper the understanding of the space. As such, we must consider both the physical components and the sensuality of any given space. Today, there exists a common misconception that space is only perceived through the sense of sight. Whereas, in fact, it makes more sense to consider space through the lens of other senses as well, given the role they play in our perception. In addition to the other senses, I would like to highlight the kinesthetic sense, a system described by James Gibson that explains how we understand the position of our own bodies in space. The process of perceiving space involves the mutual interaction of space and body, where the agency of the body is revealed as an act of movement, which in turn informs the spatial experience. So, in an urban context, this movement takes the form of walking. Based on this relationship, I decided to focus on walkability as well, obtaining measurement criteria from the existing literature and grouping them under four main headings: attractiveness, accessibility, comfort, and safety. For the fieldwork portion of my research, I decided to work in Kadıköy neighborhood of Istanbul, Turkey. The first stage of my research involved dividing the space into four segments, each of which had a different character, and evaluating their walkability levels by applying these analyses. I will now describe the character of the four chosen space. This section A segment has 3 lanes of 3 meter wide carriageway, 3 meter 2 bus lanes, and 3 meter for a tramway. There is a 5 meter wide sidewalk on the left and 16 meter wide sidewalk on the right. Pedestrian movement is restricted by street lamps and tram poles. In segment A, there are buildings under construction and neglected, dilapidated structures. Sidewalks in segment A are occupied by street vendors, electric scooters, tables and chairs outside the cafes and restaurants, and motorcycles. No burial was observed in this area. This section of segment B consists of a 3-lane carriageway, 3 meter tramway, and sidewalk with a width of 2.5 meter on the left and 4 meter on the right. Sidewalks are again interrupted by tram poles and lighting fixtures. Compared to section A, the the sidewalks and the roads are both narrower in this section. And again, there are buildings under construction, neglected and dilapidated. The sidewalks, which are occupied by scooters, commercial tubes, and street vendors, are again interrupted, with braille lettering only to be found in front of commercial spaces and not, for example, pedestrian crossing. In this section of segment C, there is only one 3-meter wide lane for vehicles and a tram. Steps are required to reach the sidewalks from both sides of the tramway, though they are only visible in the first half of the segment. And sidewalk is 5-meter wide on both the right and left side. The presence of seating elements and trees attracts attention. Unlike section C, it is noteworthy that in this section of segment D, there are no steps on either side of the trams, but rather multicolored rounded border elements. And the presence of seating fixtures and trees are characteristic features of this segment. The sidewalks are occupied by chairs and benches outside cafes and restaurants, as well as by motorcycles, electric scooters, and designated spaces for parking them. Let's take a deeper look. Firstly, I analyzed the function of the ground floor because they would affect the results of the multisensory experience analysis differently. I considered restaurants and cafes separately from commercial spaces. I found that segment A consisted mostly of cafes, restaurants, and commercial spaces. Segment B and C were predominantly commercial, and all three were distributed approximately equally in segment D. And next, I analyzed the number of stories. I found that 9 stories buildings are dominant in general of segment A, B, and C. And next, historical items. When we look at each segment, we see each segment had at least one historical building. And next analyzing is looking at the landscape elements. I found that there were no trees in segment A and B, and the number of seating elements was low in segment B. Landscape elements were concentrated in segment C and D. And next, segment A and B were the most difficult segments to cross. And when we look at the slope analysis, we see segment A, B, C were slightly sloping at around 2%. There was no slope in the segment D. According to the data I obtained, segment D was the best segment in terms of walkability, while segment B was the worst. Segment A and B and C and D were close to each other. For the second stage of my research, I used a commented walk method to analyze the perception of the selected spaces. Interviewers were asked to describe the space as precisely as possible as they were walking through it, utilizing all 6 senses. The data obtained were transcribed and used to create sensory graphs, which were then compared with the results of the walkability analysis I had carried out on the spaces. Let's take a look at the experience of a sample interviewee. The orange line shows the route chosen through the space. For example, in segment A, the interviewee positively associated the mask with the sense of sight, stated that he liked the smells coming from the cafes and vendors, and claimed he was disturbed by the sound of vehicles and also people. I then quantified his statements, assigning them numerical values based on how frequently he referenced each senses, and I created a sensory graph from the resulting data points. The process was repeated for each segment. Interestingly, the same stimuli, like for example noise of people, were perceived either positively or negatively in different segments, suggesting that the other sensory elements of the physical space played a role in how each individual stimulus was actually experienced by the person. And then I repeated the same study for the other 8 participants, total 9, and noticed some interesting commonalities, such as the positive perception of the bull statue, the opera house, and human voices, to mention a few. Here we can see broad groupings of sensory experience and how the participants related them to the walkability criteria. Those highlighted in black, such as the opera house building, were perceived positively. Those in red, like cigarette smoking, were perceived negatively. Considering the data gathered from the commitment walk, I found that negative sensory experience were mostly experienced in segment A, while positive sensory experience were broadly associated with segment D. The segments ranked from most to least positive sensory arousal are D, C, B, and A. D and C show a linear relationship between walkability and sensory experience. A and B sections show an inverse relationship. I would also like to note that segments A and B were the 2 worst according to both evaluations made within the scope of both concepts. Next, I analyzed the parameters mentioned by the interviewees and the senses that they associated with those parameters. I found that the senses of sight and taste were associated with attractiveness and safety. Smell and hearing, on the other hand, with attractiveness and comfort, and touch and kinesthetic senses with all 4 parameter groups. So, upon analysis of the data I gathered, it became clear that evaluating a space through only walkability parameters alone is not sufficient to explain the way sensory stimuli are perceived by its users. Instead of considering a city as a fixed entity, it makes actually more sense to think of it as consisting of fragmented stimuli that change with the movement of the subject. As such, it follows that ensuring the continuity of movement and a comfortable walking road will enable the wider perception of these stimuli and consequently the experience of spatial diversity. Subjects taking an active role in urban space can elevate urban design from being purely representational to playing a vital role in everyday life and integrating design space with lived space. Therefore, it makes sense to consider making and using together in the design process rather than as separated actions. By establishing close relationships with their surroundings, humans actually collect sensory data and make sense of them in their minds. This close relationship can be cultivated through walking, actually. I further concluded that urban space is not a synthetic phenomenon, and that the urban design process needs to be addressed through the multi-dimensional and variable structure of the subject and object relationship. And finally, the diversity of the participants' experiences made it clear that the same space was continually reinventing itself, using the six senses as a vehicle for that reproduction. As such, designers should focus on developing multisensory design practices moving forward, which will require new techniques to be developed on multi-modal approach systems occupied for all of the senses. And here you can now check out my references that I used. And yes, thank you so much for listening.